Imagine waking up in the pitch dark to the toll of a heavy bell. The air is freezing, the stone floor bites at your bare feet, and the first thing demanded of you is silence. No conversation, no comfort, only prayer. And this is just the beginning. By the end of the day, you would already be questioning whether you could survive another. Tonight, we begin with the quiet and unfamiliar world of the medieval monastery. A place where life was measured, not in years, but in the ringing of bells. Where silence spoke louder than words, and every hour was surrendered to prayer, labour, and reflection. To us, it feels almost unimaginable. Could we endure even a single day behind those walls? Could we rise with the bells in the cold, eat meals without pleasure, and live each hour according to rules that never changed? That's the mystery we're exploring tonight. Why you wouldn't survive a day in a medieval monastery. So, before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see how these stories connect us across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's step quietly together into a world of stone walls, endless prayers, and the weight of silence. The day in a medieval monastery did not begin with the warmth of sunrise or the gentle sounds of birds calling in the morning air. It began in darkness, in the deepest hours of night, when most of the surrounding world was still asleep. Somewhere in the cold silence, long before the first hints of dawn appeared, the monastery bell would ring. It was not a delicate sound, not a sweet chime meant to soothe or wake gently. It was a heavy, echoing strike of iron against metal, carrying across stone corridors and into the sleeping chambers of the monks. The bell did not ask if you were ready to rise. It commanded. Its sound was sharp, abrupt, and absolute, echoing against bare walls and wooden beams until it pressed into the ears of every man who had sworn himself to this life. To live in such a place meant that sleep was never entirely your own. The first call came in the middle of the night. For matins, the long service of nocturnal prayer. Imagine lying on a thin straw mattress, wrapped in little more than coarse wool, the air in your small cell bitterly cold, your breath visible in the dim glow of a tallow candle. Your eyes are heavy, your body aches with weariness, but there is no question of staying beneath the covers. The bell insists. And so you rise, your bare feet meeting the chill of the stone floor. Every step is a reminder of discomfort, a small sting that wakes you more effectively than the sound itself. There is something peculiar about beginning your day in darkness. Modern life is ruled by clocks, alarms, and the predictable cycle of sunrise and sunset, but the monk's day ignored all of that. Time was measured by devotion, not by convenience. The ringing bell was not simply a call to wake. It was a reminder that your life was no longer your own. You were not waking because you were rested, or because the day had begun, but because obedience demanded it. The strangeness of this routine is difficult to grasp from a modern perspective, where sleep is valued as health, as comfort, as a basic human need. In the monastery, sleep was treated as an obstacle. Too much of it was considered laziness, even a temptation of sin. As the monks stirred, the silence of the cloister was broken only by the shuffle of sandals against the floor. No words were spoken, no greetings exchanged. The vow of silence hung heavily, and so the men filed quietly from their narrow cells into the darkened hallways. Torches and oil lamps flickered weakly, casting long shadows that swayed with the draught of cold air, pushing through cracks in the stone. The Mundrost monastery was vast in its stillness. Every sound seemed magnified, the creak of a wooden door, the cough of an old brother clearing his throat, the low rumble of the bell continuing to toll. The walk from the dormitory to the chapel was not long. Yet in the night, it felt endless. The corridors were lined with stone, their surfaces rough and cold, their corners home to spiders and the occasional mouse scurrying from one shadow to another. The air smelled faintly of wax, smoke, and damp earth. It was not a pleasant smell, but it was familiar, and after years of living here, the monks did not notice. For someone new, however, the mingling of smells, sounds, and shadows would have felt oppressive, heavy on the senses. At last, the procession of silent figures would reach the church. A heavy wooden door opened into a cavernous room, and the faintest trace of light filtered through stained glass, though at this hour the glass was black, impenetrable to the night outside. Only the flames of tall candles lit the interior. They flickered against carved stone pillars, casting the outlines of saints and biblical figures into a trembling, shifting relief. The sound of the bell ceased, replaced by the low beginning of chant. This was the true start of the day, though in truth, it was still night. Matins could last for hours. Psalms were read in Latin, one after another, their tones monotone, steady, repetitive. To modern ears, the rhythm might seem sleep-inducing, almost hypnotic, but for the monks, it was not meant to lull, but to remind. Every phrase repeated a devotion, a reminder of faith, a reminder of obedience. Imagine standing in that line of men, your body still aching from leaving sleep too soon, your stomach empty, the chill of stone seeping through your sandals. You chant, you listen, you breathe the cold air, and you begin to lose all sense of time. Was it minutes? Was it hours? Time itself blurred, measured only by the voice of the reader and the answering drone of the brothers. What makes this ritual uniquely strange is how it trained the body to detach from ordinary life. In the world outside the monastery walls, the night was a time of rest. In the monastery, it was filled with obligation. The body was denied the comfort of long sleep, denied the ease of warmth, denied the freedom of time. In this way, the bell was more than a sound. It was a command that pierced into the mind, a reminder that the monk's life was not his own, but belonged entirely to the rhythm of the monastery. There are accounts from visitors to monasteries in the Middle Ages who found the practice almost unbearable. Some wrote of the strange disorientation of waking in the night, of how the chanting seemed to stretch time into eternity. One curious story, half forgotten in dusty manuscripts, describes a novice who claimed that during matins he often saw shapes moving in the shadows. Not fellow monks, not animals, but figures that seemed to shift in the flickering light, as though the strain of sleeplessness and the monotone of chants made the mind conjure its own companions. He was not accused of lying, nor of seeing demons, but rather told that such visions were the natural result of a mind too accustomed to distraction. In silence, you will see many things that are not there, an elder monk told him, but you must ignore them, for the shadows do not pray. The strangeness of this detail is worth noting. In silence and monotony, the human mind begins to invent. Without conversation, without distraction, without rest, shadows grow into forms, and sounds echo into imagined voices. This was not encouraged, but it was accepted as part of life within the walls. The monastery was not simply a place of prayer, but a place where the senses themselves were retrained, where reality itself became altered by routine. As the hours stretched on, the chanting continued, each psalm delivered with patience. The voices rose and fell together, not in passion, but in discipline. It was not the beauty of music that mattered, but the obedience of sound. To listen to it for long enough was to feel yourself dissolving into something larger, something that had no end and no beginning. The words blurred, the sounds merged, and the individual became unimportant. It was a strange comfort, and also a quiet oppression. By the time the prayers ended, it was often close to dawn. The faintest grey light filtered into the chapel, softening the shadows, revealing more clearly the tired faces of the monks. They did not smile, nor did they greet one another. They simply turned, silently, and returned to their cells, or to the next duty of the day. Sleep would not return. Rest was over. The bell had rung, and the day had begun. And here lies the heart of why you would not survive a day in a medieval monastery. It is not simply the cold, or the silence, or the food. It is the surrender of your time. From the very first bell in the darkness, you are no longer a person who wakes when rested, who sleeps when tired. You are a servant to the rhythm of bells and prayers, to the endless cycle of hours that divide the day. Even in the very first step, rising from your straw mattress in the bitter dark, you begin to realize that survival here is not measured by strength or endurance, but by surrender. To live in a monastery was to give up the ordinary world, to wake when told, to pray when commanded, to sleep when permitted. It was a slow erasure of the self. The morning bell was not just a sound. It was the announcement that your life was no longer yours. And if you listen closely, even centuries later, you might still hear its echo in the cold silence of those ancient stone halls. Life inside a medieval monastery was ruled not by clocks, nor by the sun and the seasons, but by prayer. To us, prayer may seem like a personal moment, a quiet reflection chosen freely. But here, it was not a matter of choice. It was a schedule, a burr, rhythm that divided the day into strict, repeating fragments. From the first sound of the bell in the night, the hours unfolded like links in a chain, each pulling you steadily, unceasingly toward the next. This was known as the divine office, or the liturgy of the hours, and to live within the monastery was to surrender to it completely. The day was broken into 8 separate services, each with its own name, its own time, and its own expectations. In the dark before dawn came matins, often the longest and most demanding. With it was Lauds, a prayer that greeted the sunrise even before it had properly arrived. Later came Prime, Terza, Sext, Nun, Vespers, and finally Compline, the evening service before sleep. To speak these names is to feel the cadence of a life without interruption, where hours are not hours as we know them, but sacred intervals in which every action must pause. The work of the body and the fleeting thoughts of the mind were all bent toward these repeated ceremonies. Imagine for a moment what it would mean to live in such a rhythm. You rise in the night to pray, return to your narrow bed for a brief rest, only to be pulled again from your duties at prime. Perhaps you are bent over a manuscript in the scriptorium, carefully copying the delicate curves of a letter with a trembling hand, when the bell strikes again. The page must be left, the ink left to dry, the thought abandoned, for the next service awaits. Or perhaps you are outside, turning soil with a wooden spade, your back aching, sweat damp on your brow. When the bell interrupts, the tool is dropped, the soil unfinished, the rhythm of work broken in mid-motion. There was no moment so ordinary, so personal, so important, that it could not be interrupted. The prayer came first. The peculiar strangeness of this system was not only in its frequency, but in its demand for precision. The monks did not simply pray when they felt moved to do so. They prayed at exact intervals, carefully, timed, often before hunger had been satisfied, before sleep had been properly taken, before tasks had been completed. Time was not fluid, but broken into small pieces, and each piece belonged not to the monk but to God. It is curious to think how the human mind, given enough repetition, bends itself to such a schedule. The body begins to anticipate the bell, even dread it, until all thought of personal time has disappeared. To sit in the choir, where the monks gathered for each service, was to experience time differently than we do today. The prayers were long, the psalms repetitive, the chants steady and unchanging. Nothing rushed, nothing leapt forward. Instead, the rhythm moved slowly, deliberately, like water dripping steadily from a stone ledge. Some found in this slowness a peace that the world outside could not provide, but for others, especially novices still unaccustomed to the life, it was suffocating. There are small accounts of novices who fell asleep during the readings, their heads nodding forward until a stern glance from an elder jolted them upright. It was not allowed to sleep through God's words, though the temptation was ever present. The monotony was a kind of test, a discipline of endurance as much as of faith. The curious thing about the repetition is how it dissolved the sense of individuality. The chants were not sung for beauty, but for unity. Each voice blended into the others, forming a single sound that belonged to no one. If one voice faltered, the others carried on, seamless and uninterrupted. This was not performance, but practice, the practice of becoming small, of erasing the self within the larger community of faith. For a modern listener, it is difficult to imagine the effect. To speak the same words, in the same tone, with the same group of men, 8 times a day, every day, year after year, is to lose something of one's own identity. And yet, this loss was seen not as a tragedy, but as the highest devotion. At times, however, strangeness crept in. A monk who copied manuscripts by day would sometimes find himself reciting the same psalm he had written only hours before. The lines blurred, the prayers echoing not only in the chapel but on the page and in his memory, until they became inseparable from the rest of life. One medieval chronicler noted that some older monks could recite entire books of psalms by heart, not as an act of pride, but because the words had been woven into their minds so tightly that they could not be forgotten. This was not unusual. It was expected. And yet, to live with so many words constantly repeated, so many phrases circling endlessly through the day, is to wonder, did they ever lose track of where prayer ended and thought began? There were also rules within the services themselves. One could not simply sit comfortably, drifting in and out of attention. Bodies were required to move with the words, to stand, to kneel, to bow. The shifting postures gave form to the chant, but also introduced physical strain. Kneeling on cold stone for long stretches, rising and sitting with rigid discipline, wore on the joints and muscles. The monotony was not only mental, but physical. If one faltered, the sound of sandals scraping against stone would reveal it, and the shame of not keeping rhythm with the others could weigh heavier than any scolding. There was a strange paradox within this cycle. On the one hand, the repetition flattened life into sameness. Each day mirrored the one before it, so closely that memory blurred. A monk of 50 years might struggle to recall a single specific Tuesday in all his decades, because each Tuesday was the same. Yet at the same time, the cycle gave structure to existence, a framework so firm that life could not slip into chaos. The endless return of prayer was both prison and anchor. Visitors to monasteries sometimes found the experience unsettling. To be pulled into the choir at the appointed hours, to sit for so long in one chant without speaking one's own thoughts, was deeply foreign. Some reported that time seemed to slow to a crawl, while others said it slipped away entirely, vanishing in the drone of the voices. There is one curious account of a traveller who noted that after attending 3 services in one day, he could no longer recall whether he had eaten, or even how much time had passed. The prayers had stretched and bent his sense of the day until it no longer seemed divided into morning, noon and night, but into psalms, chants and silences. For the monks, this was the very purpose of the system. To live according to human hours was to live according to desire, to hunger when hungry, to sleep when tired, to work when convenient. To live according to divine hours was to erase those desires, to strip away the ordinary needs of the body and replace them with obedience. The strangeness of the cycle was that it demanded not only devotion but surrender. You did not decide when to pray, when to eat, when to rest. The bell decided, the community decided, the rhythm of the divine office decided. As the day wore on, the cycle pressed on relentlessly. Terce, sext, none, each arrived with its own bell, each interrupted the tasks of the day. To the modern imagination, this constant breaking of attention seems unbearable. And yet, there was a quiet in it too. By surrendering to the rhythm, The monk no longer needed to wonder what came next. There was no choice to be made, no plan to arrange. Each hour carried him forward, as steady and predictable as the tides. It was a cycle that wore away the self like water over stone, slowly, unceasingly, until what remained was not individuality but devotion. By the time Vespers arrived, the day was nearly spent. The sun dipped low, shadows stretched long across the cloister, and once more the monks filed into the church. Their voices, weary but steady, rose in chant again. There was no surprise, no novelty, no change, only the familiar, the eternal, the endless. And finally, when Compline was sung, and the monks withdrew into the silence of night, they knew that only a few short hours remained before the bell would strike again, and the cycle would begin anew. This was the strange burden of life in a monastery, the endless cycle of prayer, steady and unyielding, shaping every moment of every day. It was a rhythm that few could endure, for it demanded not strength nor intelligence, but surrender. To live in such a way was to abandon the ordinary flow of life, to allow the self to dissolve into repetition. And if you listen closely, in the silence between each breath, you may still hear it, the faint echo of chanting voices, rising and falling in the same tones, at the same hours, in the same cycle that once stretched across centuries. The silence of a medieval monastery was not an absence of sound, but rather the presence of something heavier, something that lingered and pressed itself against the mind like the weight of thick stone walls. For a monk living under the rule, silence was not simply a choice but a vow, one that stretched across hours, days, and years, shaping the rhythm of his life more than food, sleep, or even prayer. Imagine waking each morning not only to the toll of the bell, but to the knowledge that nearly everything you wished to say would remain locked inside your own head, spoken only in thought, never given release through sound. There were gestures, of course, little movements of the hand or a nod of the head that served as a kind of language among the monks. But these gestures, so carefully prescribed, could never carry the warmth of conversation nor the spontaneous joy of words shared between friends. They were fragments of communication, stripped of tone and feeling, designed only to make daily life possible without breaking the greater silence. A finger pressed to the lips might call for quiet. A sweeping motion of the hand might ask for bread at the table. A tilt of the head might indicate permission. It was enough to survive, but never enough to feel fully alive. Silence was meant to be a teacher. It was thought to open the soul to God by closing it to the noise of the world. But silence does not arrive empty. Instead, it fills itself with the faintest of sounds, the scratching of a quill on parchment, the creak of a wooden bench beneath shifting weight, the steady drip of water from a stone gutter after rain. These small sounds, unnoticed in ordinary life, took on a strange intensity in the cloister. The scrape of sandals on the flagstones could echo like thunder in the still air. The turning of pages in the scriptorium could feel like a storm of whispers. And perhaps the strangest of all was how the silence seemed to bend time itself, slowing the passage of minutes until hours stretched into something long and heavy. For those unaccustomed to such quiet, the silence could be unnerving. A visitor might feel the impulse to speak just to prove that the world was still moving, still alive. But a monk learned to live inside that silence, and sometimes he came to fear what lay within it. Without the constant chatter of human voices, the mind turned inward, and thoughts that had been easy to ignore in daily life became impossible to escape. A forgotten memory might rise unbidden during the long pause of a meal. A doubt about faith might echo louder than the toll of any bell. A small resentment against a fellow brother might replay endlessly because there was no casual talk to let it dissipate. Silence made everything sharper, and not always in comforting ways. In winter, silence was paired with cold, and the two seemed to strengthen one another. Imagine walking through the cloister at dawn, your breath visible in the frigid air, your sandals thin against the frozen stones. The silence was so complete that even your own exhale seemed immodest, as if the mist of your breath were somehow a breach of order. And then, at rare intervals, the bell would toll, shattering the quiet. But even the bell seemed to become part of the silence, for once it faded, the hush returned with even greater force, as though the walls of the monastery had absorbed the sound and swallowed it whole. What may surprise you is that silence did not mean solitude. A monk was almost never alone. He lived, prayed, ate, and worked alongside dozens of others, sometimes hundreds in larger monasteries. Yet they were together in a silence so deep that it often felt more isolating than solitude itself. To sit in a refectory with 100 others, each eating from a wooden bowl, each chewing bread without a word, was to discover a paradoxical kind of loneliness. The presence of others was undeniable, the sound of spoons against wood, the shuffle of feet, the rustle of robes, but the absence of voices left each man stranded in his own mind. It was a silence crowded with people, and within that silence, peculiar customs took root. Some monasteries trained novices with strict punishments for unnecessary noise. If a spoon clattered too loudly on a bowl, the young monk might be made to eat standing, or to wait until the others had finished before he received his portion. If a novice laughed, an impulse that might arise in any young man, he might be given a penance, perhaps the recitation of extra psalms, or the labour of scrubbing the floors. The silence was defended not only by discipline but by small humiliations, designed to remind each monk that his tongue belonged not to himself but to God. Yet even in silence, communication found curious paths. In the scriptorium, where manuscripts were copied letter by painstaking letter, a monk might leave a tiny flourish, a faint sketch in the margin, a strange face or animal doodled alongside the sacred text. These drawings were not spoken words, but they were fragments of personality slipping through the cracks of silence. Some monks, despite the rules, left notes hidden in the bindings of books, small scraps of thoughts never meant to be read aloud. To see such secret writings today is to glimpse how silence pressed against the human need to express, and how even the most obedient monk sought some small way to make himself heard, if only to the future. The vow of silence was not absolute everywhere, nor in every moment. There were times when monks spoke during confession, in chapter meetings, or when instruction was required. But these moments were surrounded by such long stretches of silence that the words, when they finally came, carried an unusual weight. A sentence spoken in the cloister might be remembered for days, not because of what was said, but because it was one of the few things allowed to be said at all. Words became rare and precious, like coins carefully hoarded rather than spent. And then there is the strange question of dreams. In silence, the boundaries between waking and dreaming often blurred. Without conversation to anchor the day, a monk's inner world might grow vivid, filled with images and voices that had no outlet in waking life. It is not difficult to imagine a brother rising from his straw bed after a night of strange dreams, carrying within him words that could never be spoken, visions that had no place in the order of the monastery. Silence gave those dreams room to grow, and in doing so, it created a world within a world, private and unshareable. For you, listening now, it may be almost impossible to imagine such a life. A day without words already feels unusual, a week perhaps feels lonely, but a lifetime lived under the hush of stone corridors, the weight of unbroken silence, that is something else entirely. It is not just that you would miss laughter or conversation. You would begin to notice things you had never thought of before, the small sounds of your body, the constant hum of your own thoughts, the sharpness of a bird's cry beyond the monastery walls. Silence would reveal to you how noisy the human mind truly is, and how difficult it can be to live without the relief of sharing that noise with others. And so, the silence of the monastery was both sanctuary and burden. It was designed to bring men closer to God, but in doing so, it forced them closer to themselves, and to all the unease that dwells in the human heart. To survive a day, in such silence would not simply test your voice, it would test your patience, your thoughts, and your very sense of self. For silence, in the end, is not an emptiness to rest in, but a mirror that shows you more than you may wish to see. The monk's cell was not a room in the modern sense of the word. It was not designed for comfort, nor for individuality, nor even for the basic sense of home that we tend to associate with any four walls we call our own. Instead, the monastic cell was a place deliberately stripped of warmth, both in the physical and the emotional sense. To step inside was to step into a world that seemed to have been built to remind the occupant of his own smallness, his dependence, and the fragility of his body against the chill of stone. The walls of the cell were thick, but they did not insulate against the cold. They seemed to breathe with it, to draw the dampness of the earth and exhale it slowly into the air. The stones were often rough and uneven, their surfaces darkened by centuries of touch and weather. A single window, narrow and high, might allow a thin shaft of light to enter, though its purpose was less about illumination than about reminding the monk of the outside world. The glass, if there was any at all, would have been cloudy, and the draught it admitted would only deepen the chill that hung in the space. Inside, the furnishings were sparse. A straw-filled mattress lay across a wooden frame, sometimes no more than a pallet on the floor. The straw would shift, crackle, and eventually grow damp with use. It was replaced not when it became uncomfortable, but only when it grew, too foul to ignore. The pillow, if such a word even fits, was little more than a bundle of cloth, sometimes replaced with a block of wood or a roll of spare fabric. The bedding was coarse, woven from heavy wool that itched against the skin and carried the smell of sheep long after the cloth had been washed. In the winter, it did little to protect against the cold. In the summer, it was heavy and stifling. There was a small table, perhaps a stool, perhaps a single chair, but these were not for leisure. They were for study, for the reading of scripture, for the writing of notes, or the copying of texts when assigned. The furniture was heavy, plain, without ornament, made not to be admired but simply to exist. Even the wood itself seemed to carry an austerity, its surface worn smooth by hands that sought no comfort from it. There might be a crucifix on the wall, or an image of a saint, but decoration ended there. Nothing in the cell invited the eye to linger. To sleep in such a place was to experience the body not as something cherished, but as something endured. The cold was constant, gnawing at the edges of wakefulness, slipping into the bones during the long hours of the night. A monk would rise several times to pray, meaning that sleep was always broken, never deep, never restorative in the way we think of it today. Returning to his bed after midnight prayer, he might wrap himself tightly in the rough blanket, listening to the sound of his own breath in the darkness, waiting for warmth that rarely arrived. The silence of the night was not empty. It was filled with the shifting of straw, the faint scuttle of a mouse in the corner, the drip of water somewhere in the stone. Strangely, despite these hardships, the cell was considered a sacred space. It was a room meant to strip away distraction, to leave the monk alone with himself and with God. It was here that he confronted his own thoughts most directly, with nothing soft to hide behind. The discomfort of the spies, bed, the chill of the air, the starkness of the walls, all were meant to remind him of his vow, his discipline, and the distance between earthly comfort and spiritual devotion. Where we might see deprivation, the monk was told to see clarity, a life stripped down to its barest essentials. There are records that suggest some monks grew attached to their cells in a way that seems almost paradoxical. They gave them names, sometimes calling them paradise or heaven, though the spaces were far from what we would imagine under those words. Perhaps the strangeness lay in the way hardship itself became familiar. After years of sleeping on straw, of rising to cold air, of walking barefoot across the stone floor, the cell became not merely a place of suffering, but a companion of sorts. A silent presence that shared in the monk's spiritual labour. Yet there is another strangeness worth noting. one rarely spoken of in the tidy narratives of monastic life. In such cold, in such bare surroundings, the body sometimes reacted in peculiar ways. Monks wrote of dreams more vivid than waking life, dreams shaped by the discomfort of their sleeping conditions. Some spoke of hearing voices in the night, not the voices of their brothers, but whispers that seemed to rise from the stone itself. In the absence of warmth and ease, the mind sought its own refuge, and not always in ways that were peaceful. The line between prayer and hallucination could blur in the darkness of the cell, especially when hunger or exhaustion weighed heavily upon the body. One can imagine the strangeness of waking at dawn, after a night of fractured sleep, to see one's breath hanging in the dim air, to feel the stiffness of straw beneath the body, and to rise knowing that comfort would never be offered, not today, not tomorrow, not ever. And yet, in that rising, the monk believed he was closer to holiness, because each denial of the flesh was considered a step away from the world and a step toward the eternal. If you were to enter such a cell today, you might be struck by its smallness, its austerity, its almost oppressive simplicity. You might feel the urge to leave quickly, to return to the warmth and noise of ordinary life. But for the monk, the cell was both prison and sanctuary. It was the place where he met his own weakness, and the place where he sought his strength. To survive even a single night in such conditions would be difficult for most of us, accustomed as we are to warmth, to softness, to the comfort of a mattress and a blanket that soothes rather than scratches. But to live day after day, year after year, in such a space was to surrender to a way of life that most of us could scarcely imagine. The cold cell was not merely a room, it was a mirror of the monastic soul, stripped, bare, unadorned, and enduring. And in its silence, its chill, and its emptiness, it taught a lesson that no warm home could ever hope to teach, that comfort, in the end, was not the goal. A meal in a medieval monastery was not a feast. It was not even what we would comfortably call a meal. It was rather a ritual of sustenance, a quiet continuation of the discipline that marked every hour of the monk's day. If one imagines a banquet hall with long tables groaning under the weight of meat, bread, and flagons of ale, the image must be set aside. The monastery was a place where eating was not celebrated but tolerated, where food was not enjoyed but endured, where every bite was meant to remind the monk that he lived not for pleasure but for service. The dining hall, called the refectory, was a long room of stone, its ceilings high, its windows narrow, its light dim, even on bright afternoon. Wooden benches stretched along heavy tables, the wood scarred by decades of use, each mark the faint impression of a life once lived in silence. The air was cool, often carrying the faint smell of boiled vegetables, or the sharper tang of onions, leeks, or cabbage in the winter months. The refectory could be so cold that the bowls placed on the table steamed, their warmth rising briefly before vanishing into the chill. Meals began not with conversation but with the toll of a bell. Monks filed into the refectory in silence, their sandals scraping against the stone. Each took his place, standing behind his bench until all were gathered. A prayer was recited, usually by the abbot or another appointed brother, and only then would they sit, the wooden benches creaking in unison like a kind of music. Yet even then, no one spoke. Instead, a single monk, chosen for the task, would mount the lectern at the far end of the hall and begin to read aloud. The reading was often scripture, though sometimes it might be the life of a saint, or a commentary on some passage of theology. The words filled the air, not to entertain, but to remind the monks that even as they ate, their minds should be on higher things. The strange part, perhaps, is that the words were rarely acknowledged. No one commented on them, no one asked a question, no one laughed at a story or frowned at a difficult idea. They simply listened, or perhaps they did not. For some, the drone of the reader's voice became a kind of background hum, blending with the scrape of spoons against bowls, a sound as steady and inevitable as the tolling of the bells. The food itself was plain to the point of severity. Bread was the most constant element, baked in the monastery's own ovens, dense and coarse, more fuel than comfort. Soups or pottages, made from beans, peas, or whatever vegetables were in season, were ladled into wooden bowls. Sometimes there was cheese, sharp and crumbly, made from the milk of the monastery's cows or goats. On rare occasions, fish might appear, especially on feast days or Fridays. Meat, however, was forbidden to most monks, and the absence of it shaped not only the flavour of their meals but also their bodies, lean and wiry from a lifetime of sparse nutrition. There were rules too about how much could be eaten. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed so many monasteries, laid out precise limits. 1 pound of bread per day, 2 cooked dishes, perhaps a third if fruit was available. Wine, diluted with water, was sometimes allowed, though never in excess. To eat more than this was to fall into gluttony, a sin to be resisted. To eat less was to invite weakness, which interfered with prayer and work. The balance was fine, and it was always tilted toward restraint. Imagine sitting at one of those long tables, a bowl of lukewarm soup before you, a crust of bread at your side. You lift the spoon, carved of wood, and taste the broth. It is thin, flavoured more by absence than by richness, a reminder of the soil from which the vegetables came rather than a celebration of their flavour. You chew the bread, its crust hard, its crumb dense, the taste earthy and filling but without delight. Around you, 100 others do the same. The only sounds the rhythmic scrape of spoons and the steady voice of the reader. No laughter, no conversation, no sigh of satisfaction, only the functional act of nourishment framed by silence and scripture. And yet, even within such strict boundaries, the human desire for variety found its ways. Some monks became skilled at growing herbs, planting thyme, sage or parsley in the monastery gardens to lend at least a faint hint of flavour to the otherwise bland dishes. Others learned to bake bread in subtle variations, darker loaves or lighter ones, depending on the flour available. There were even occasional complaints preserved in records, monks grumbling about the thinness of their broth or the scarcity of cheese. These moments of dissatisfaction remind us that even the most disciplined men were still human, their bodies still longing for the pleasures they had vowed to deny. Strangely enough, the absence of talk at meals meant that food sometimes took on an almost dreamlike quality. With nothing to distract the mind, a monk might find himself staring at the steam rising from his bowl, watching it curl and vanish into the air, or at the way the candlelight caught the surface of his bread. The act of eating slowed, became contemplative, almost detached. To chew in silence, while hearing words from scripture echo against the stone walls, was to experience food less as an event of the body and more as a passing necessity, something done because it must be done, not because it brought joy. The peculiar rules of dining extended beyond what was eaten to how it was eaten. Monks were expected to finish everything placed before them, to waste nothing. If a man found the soup too thin or the bread too hard, he was to eat it anyway, for complaint was itself a form of sin. To show too much pleasure in food was also discouraged. One was to eat with moderation, to sit with hands folded when finished, to leave the table only when dismissed by the abbot. In this way, even the simple act of eating became part of the discipline, a test of humility, patience, and obedience. Visitors often found this strange. For them, meals were times of fellowship, of conversation, of shared laughter. To sit in silence, listening only to the sound of spoons and the droning of a reader, seemed almost unbearable. Some described it as oppressive, others as strangely calming. Perhaps it depended on one's temperament. To some, the silence pressed down like a weight. To others, it opened a space for reflection, a rare pause in the constant noise of the world. There were, however, moments when the monotony of these meals was broken, and it is in these rare moments that we glimpse something of the hidden humanity of the monks. On feast days, the refectory might be decorated with greenery or flowers, the tables laid with better bread, perhaps even a sweet dish of honey or dried fruit. The reader's voice would still fill the air, but the atmosphere was lighter, more generous. Some records speak of monks smiling quietly to themselves when a rare treat was set before them, the pleasure of taste sneaking past the barriers of discipline. These small breaks in the routine, precisely because they were so rare, carried a weight far greater than their modest ingredients might suggest. But there is also something curious in the way food shaped the dreams of the monks. Deprived of rich flavors, deprived of abundance, they sometimes reported dreams of banquets, of tables groaning with meats and pies, of wines poured endlessly into golden cups. These were not dreams they could confess with pride, but they were dreams nonetheless, the body asserting itself in the quiet hours of the night. It is a strange thought that while their waking hours were disciplined, their sleeping minds rebelled, conjuring visions of plenty in the midst of deprivation. For you, accustomed to meals filled with variety, with conversation, with warmth and laughter, a single day in the monastery refectory would feel heavy, perhaps unbearably so. The food would not satisfy you, the silence would feel stifling, the ritual would seem strange. But for the monk, this was not merely food, it was another form of prayer, another form of discipline. To deny the senses was to sharpen the soul. To eat without pleasure was to remember that the body was not the master. And so the meal without pleasure became a lesson repeated daily, a rhythm as steady as the tolling of the bells. To us, it seems strange, perhaps even cruel. But to the monks, it was a path, narrow and difficult, leading not to the satisfaction of the stomach, but to the quieting of the spirit. The rhythm of a monk's day was not held together only by bells and prayers, but by labour. Work, in a medieval monastery, was as much a part of devotion as chanting psalms or kneeling in silence. It was not labour done for profit, nor for ambition, nor even for survival in the usual sense. It was labour shaped into prayer, toil, transformed into discipline. The monks spoke of it as ora et labora, to pray and to work. The two were woven together so closely that it was often hard to see where one ended and the other began. The work was of many kinds. In the fields, monks bent their backs to the soil, planting, weeding, harvesting. The earth was stubborn and heavy, and the tools were simple: wooden-handled hoes, iron spades, scythes worn by years of sharpening. Their hands were roughened by constant contact with the soil, their skin darkened by the sun in summer, chapped by wind in winter. Each action was repetitive, and in that repetition, something curious emerged. A row of beans planted in straight lines, a furrow cut evenly into the earth, a sheaf of wheat tied with practiced movements. Each became like a kind of liturgy, a prayer spoken not with words but with motion. In the gardens, monks tended herbs with a precision that bordered on the meditative. Beds of sage, rosemary, lavender, and mint were not arranged for beauty but for usefulness. Their leaves gathered for food, for medicine, for the care of the sick. The gardens smelled of damp earth and crushed greenery, a quiet perfume that lingered on the air as monks bent low to pluck or prune. The act of caring for a plant, of coaxing it to grow, became a silent dialogue between monk and creation. Some believed that to touch a plant was to feel a fragment of God's work, present in even the smallest leaf. Beyond the fields and gardens, there were other tasks. In the scriptorium, monks bent over long wooden desks, their quills scratching slowly across parchment. Copying a manuscript was not the swift motion of a pen across paper as we know it today, but an act of patience stretched across weeks and months. Each letter had to be shaped with care, each margin aligned, each page prepared with the rhythm of scraping, ruling and inking. The flicker of candles lit the desks in the darker months, their wax dripping steadily as hours turned into evenings. The silence of the scriptorium was broken only by the faint rasp of quills, a sound as delicate as insects moving through grass. What is strange, perhaps, is how these tasks blurred the line between labor and meditation. A monk might spend a full morning cutting wood for the fire or hauling water from a well, and yet he did not speak of it as work in the way we do. For him, each stroke of the axe, each pull of the bucket was a way of humbling the body, of aligning his own rhythm with the greater rhythm of the monastery. Fatigue was not an inconvenience but a companion, a reminder of his humanity and an offering he could lift up in silence. But the work was not always serene. There were moments of strain, of dull aching, of weariness that sank into the bones. Imagine a winter morning, the ground frozen hard, the cold air cutting at the skin, and the task still waiting, a field to dig, a wall to mend, a roof to repair. The tools were heavy, the tasks endless, the silence unbroken. And yet the monk bent himself to the work, not because he expected ease, but because the hardship itself was a form of devotion. In that hardship, he believed, was hidden the same truth as in prayer, that the body must bow as much as the spirit. Curiously, some monasteries kept records of the smallest details of their labor. They noted how many fish were caught, how many sheep sheared, how many loaves baked. These records were not simply for accounting, but for discipline, a way of measuring the ceaseless rhythm of human effort. The lists read almost like prayers themselves. 100 loaves, 50 bundles, 20 jars. Numbers marking the passage of days, each task completed and then forgotten, like beads sliding one after another on a rosary. The work of copying texts holds a particular strangeness worth pausing over. Imagine sitting at a desk, the parchment stretched before you, the quill dipping into ink made of soot and water. Each letter takes seconds to form, each page takes hours. Mistakes are difficult to erase. The margin must be carefully scraped with a knife, the surface smoothed again before writing resumes. To copy a full book could take a year or more, a year spent in steady, careful strokes, the mind moving slowly through the words of others. Sometimes monks grew weary, and their weariness left its mark. In the margins of old manuscripts, you can find their faint notes. This parchment is hard. The ink is thin. Oh, my hand is tired. These little outbursts of humanity slipped through the silence of labor, traces of lives long past. And then there was the strangeness of illumination, the art of decorating manuscripts with colors and gold. In an otherwise austere world, these brilliant letters and intricate designs seem almost out of place. A monk might spend hours painting the curve of a single letter, filling it with tiny animals, vines, or patterns that spiraled endlessly. The colors deep blues, rich reds, shimmering golds caught the candlelight, glowing in the dimness of the scriptorium. It is tempting to ask why such beauty was permitted in a life so stripped of joy. Perhaps it was because the work itself was joyless, and the beauty served as a prayer, an offering of effort that outlived the monk's own body. Not all work was noble. Some tasks were simply dull, sweeping the cloisters, mending robes, cleaning tools, or carrying stones. And yet, even these were given meaning. The rule of Saint Benedict insisted that no task was beneath a monk. To sweep the floor was as holy as to sing in the choir. To scrub a pot was as necessary as to copy a text. Every act, no matter how small, was to be done as though it were done for God. The strangeness lies in how completely the monks lived this truth, how they carried water with the same quiet dignity as they carried prayers. It is difficult, for us, to imagine such a life. Our work is often hurried, filled with distractions, surrounded by noise. We see labour as a means to an end, a way to secure leisure or wealth. But in the monastery, work was the end itself. It was not something to escape, but something to embrace, to return to each day with the same rhythm as prayer. In this way, the body and the soul were bound together, each labour a kind of psalm, each task a bead on the endless string of monastic hours. For you, A single day of such labour might feel unbearable. The monotony of it, the silence, the absence of pleasure or recognition. Yet for the monk, it was life itself, steady and unchanging. The field, the desk, the broom, the axe, all were teachers, all were companions. Work was not merely survival, it was a form of prayer, a rhythm of body and spirit that shaped each man slowly, quietly, into something he could not have become otherwise. And so the monastery breathed with two lungs, prayer and work. To miss one was to weaken the other. To pray without work was to drift into idleness. To work without prayer was to slip into pride. Together, they formed the rhythm of a life where every motion, no matter how small, was meant to bring the soul a little closer to the divine. It was a rhythm that few today could endure, yet one that shaped centuries of quiet devotion, written not only in books and walls, but in the very hands and backs of the men who lived it. Life in the monastery was not only shaped by prayer and labour, but also by a framework of rules so detailed, so precise, that every moment of the day was accounted for. To modern eyes, many of these rules seem strange, even unnecessary, and yet to the monks, they were the very architecture of holiness. The rule of Saint Benedict, composed in the 6th century, became the backbone of monastic life in much of medieval Europe. It was not a book of lofty visions, but of practical instructions when to rise, when to eat, when to speak, when to remain silent. It treated the soul not as an abstraction, but as something that could be disciplined into obedience through the smallest of daily choices. The strangeness begins with how all-encompassing these rules were. A monk's day did not belong to him in any sense. He could not decide when to wake, when to rest, or even how to sit in the choir. Bells rang to announce each change in the hours, and with each bell came obligation. The body learned to move without hesitation. Rise when the bell rings, bow when the abbot enters, kneel when the psalm begins. In a sense, the monk became less of an individual and more of a moving part within a greater machine. His freedom surrendered in exchange for belonging to a rhythm larger than himself. Consider the peculiar attention given to silence. The rules declared long stretches of the day when monks were forbidden to speak at all. Even during meals, no conversation was allowed. Instead, one brother read aloud from scripture or from the lives of saints, his voice filling the silence of the refectory while the others ate in quiet. This silence was not only about avoiding idle chatter, it was thought to guard the soul against sin. Words, after all, could wound, tempt, or distract. And so the monk's tongue was bound, leaving him to dwell in the quiet murmur of his own thoughts. The strange effect of this discipline is that many monks recorded hearing their own inner voice more clearly, as though silence turned the mind itself into a monastery. The rules extended even into how food was consumed. Meat, for example, was forbidden in many monasteries except in cases of illness. Meals were simple: bread, vegetables, legumes, perhaps fish on certain days. Portions were measured with care. The rule of Saint Benedict allowed for a pound of bread each day, a small measure of wine, and only 2 cooked dishes at a meal. Eating was not meant for pleasure, but for sustenance alone. To overeat was to fall into the sin of gluttony, and so each meal was a reminder that the body must always be disciplined, never indulged. There is something quietly unsettling about imagining a community where every bite you take is monitored, where appetite is never trusted, and where even hunger itself is seen as a test of faith. Clothing, too, was dictated by rule. Monks wore habits of wool, often coarse and plain, usually in shades of brown, black, or grey. Each man was allotted 2 tunics and 2 cowls, so that while one was being washed, the other could be worn. The garments were not tailored for comfort, and their roughness served as a constant reminder of humility. Shoes were simple sandals, though in the cold of northern winters, some houses permitted socks or leather shoes. Imagine living every season, every ceremony, in the same limited garments, their fabric stiff against the skin, their smell of damp wool lingering after rain. The body itself was clothed in a rule, as though even fabric carried the weight of discipline. The monks' sleep was regulated with the same precision. They rose in the deep hours of the night for matins, the long prayers that began the day. Afterward, they were sometimes permitted to rest again, but always in their clothes, on hard pallets of straw, often with little more than a blanket. Beds were not spaces of luxury, but of necessity, designed to remind the sleeper that rest was temporary and incomplete. The strangeness here lies in how deliberately discomfort was woven into life, as though by making the body uneasy, the soul might become more alert. Then, there were rules for the smallest gestures: how to bow, how to enter the choir, how to keep one's eyes lowered in humility. The rule even outlined how monks should treat their tools as sacred vessels of the altar. A hoe, a spade, a book, none could be left lying carelessly. To misuse or damage such an item was not simply clumsiness, it was a breach of reverence. Here again the curious blurring of boundaries appears. In the monastery, there was no strict divide between sacred and ordinary. Every tool, every act, every moment carried the same weight. One of the stranger aspects of monastic discipline was the system of correction and punishment. If a monk broke the silence, he might be required to eat alone, away from his brothers. If he disobeyed, he could be forbidden from joining in the psalms, forced to stand silently while others sang. More serious offences could mean physical penance, days of fasting, or even expulsion. Punishment was not meant to humiliate, but to correct, to bend the will back into obedience. Yet, for someone not raised in such a life, the severity of these corrections would have been difficult to endure. The smallest slip of the tongue, the tiniest breach of decorum, could carry consequences that marked you out from your brothers. There is also the curious way that rules sought to erase individuality. Monks often gave up their birth names upon entering the monastery, taking on new names as a sign of their rebirth into a different life. Family ties were severed, possessions were surrendered. No one could own anything, not a book, not a pen, not even the clothes he wore. Everything was held in common. To ask for something privately was seen as selfishness. The strange effect of this discipline was to dissolve the individual into the community, until each monk became almost indistinguishable from the next, his voice blending into the chant, his body moving with the same motions, his will bent into the collective. And yet, within this sameness, peculiarities persisted. Some monks were noted for their excessive zeal in following rules, chastising others for the smallest infractions. Others were known for their quiet patience, enduring discomfort without complaint. The rule itself recognized that not all men were equal in strength or constitution. Older monks or those in poor health might receive lighter duties or more generous allowances. Even in the rigidity of discipline, the human body could not be completely ignored. To imagine yourself in this life is to imagine being constantly observed, not by guards or overseers, but by the rule itself. Every step, every gesture, every silence was weighed against a measure of obedience. There was no corner of life unmarked by regulation. To modern eyes, this might feel suffocating, but to the monk, it was freedom of a strange kind. By submitting to rules so absolute, he no longer bore the burden of decision. He did not wonder what to eat, what to wear, when to sleep, when to rise. The rule decided for him, and in that surrender, he found a kind of peace. One of the more unusual practices was the chapter of faults. Each day, monks would gather and confess their small failings publicly before the community. A brother might admit to speaking when he should have been silent, or to daydreaming during prayer, or to mishandling a tool. The abbot would then assign a small penance, often something as simple as standing apart from the others or waiting until the end of the meal. What is strange here is not the act of confession itself, but its frequency and its triviality. Imagine standing before your peers to confess not a great sin, but a moment of forgetfulness or a slip of the hand. The effect was both humbling and binding. The community was reminded daily of each other's weakness. and yet they bore those weaknesses together. Another curious detail lies in the way the rule ordered time. The year itself was divided not just by seasons but by feasts, fasts, and holy days. Lent brought stricter discipline, less food, more prayer, longer hours of silence. Easter brought celebration, though even celebration was muted compared to the outside world. Time moved not by months or weeks, but by liturgy. The monk lived inside a calendar shaped entirely by faith, each day marked by ritual, each season heavy with symbolism. For us, time is measured by work and leisure, by appointments and deadlines. For the monk, it was measured by prayer and penance, by the ebb and flow of sacred observances. The strangeness of such a life is that, after enough years, the rules ceased to feel like restrictions. They became the air the monk breathed, the structure that held him upright. To live without them would have seemed impossible, even frightening. In their severity, they offered stability. In their detail, they offered clarity. It is difficult to say whether this clarity brought true peace or merely dulled the sharp edges of human longing. Perhaps both. For someone like you or me, to step into such a world would be to step into a cage. Yet for the monk, it was a sanctuary. The rules that bound him were the same rules that freed him from the chaos of choice. His days unfolded with the inevitability of a tide, carrying him from bell to bell, from prayer to labour, from silence to sleep. There was little room for individuality, for pleasure, for spontaneity, but there was, in its place, a steady rhythm that held him close, as though he were a stone laid into a great wall, fitted precisely into place, never moving, never changing. And so the strange rules and daily discipline of the monastery, which to us might feel like suffocation, became for the monks the very air they breathed. It was a life of boundaries, yet within those boundaries lay a freedom that is hard for us to imagine, a freedom not of choice, but of surrender, not of self-expression, but of silence. It was a life few today could survive, and yet it endured for centuries, shaping the quiet lives of countless men who believed that holiness was found not in grand gestures, but in the smallest acts of daily obedience. The monastery was a world shaped as much by its architecture as by its prayers. Its walls did not simply contain life, they dictated it, guided it, and in many ways defined it. Perhaps no feature illustrates this more clearly than the long, dim corridors that connected the cells, the cloister, the chapel, and the refectory. These passageways were not designed for beauty. Their stones were often rough, their windows few, their corners sharp and unadorned. Yet for the monks who walked them, day after day, year after year, the corridors became something more than mere space. They were both arteries of movement and chambers of silence, places where the rules of monastic life became not abstract but physical. To walk a corridor in a medieval monastery was to enter into a space where the air itself seemed charged with quiet. Voices did not echo here, because voices were rarely permitted. A monk walked with measured steps, his sandals scuffing softly against the stone floor, his head lowered, his eyes not darting about but focused downward. Silence was not just a matter of keeping the mouth closed, it was also a way of carrying the body. Even the rhythm of walking was disciplined, no rushing, no lingering, no unnecessary sound. The corridor was not a place to converse, but a place to pass, as one might pass through a dream without disturbing it. And yet the strange thing is that, over time, the corridor itself began to feel alive. Monks sometimes wrote of how the silence of these spaces seemed to press against them, as though the very stones were listening. Imagine walking alone at dusk, the light fading, the draught moving in from a distant door, and feeling not that you were alone, but that you were being observed not by another monk, not by an abbot, but by the building itself. The corridor's silence was not empty, it was watchful, and in that watchfulness lay both comfort and unease. The monotony of the corridor was deliberate. Its length was unbroken by ornament. There were no paintings on the walls, no banners, no colour to break the plainness of stone. The only marks of time were the grooves worn into the floor by centuries of passing feet, and perhaps the faint scratches where a lamp bracket had once been fixed. This absence of decoration was meant to strip the senses of distraction, so that the monk's thoughts might turn inward or upward, but it also meant that the mind, deprived of stimulus, sometimes filled the emptiness with its own inventions. Many monks spoke of imagining shapes in the stone, faces emerging where none had been carved, figures glimpsed in the shadows, vanishing as soon as the eyes fixed upon them. During the day, the corridors were passages filled with movement. Brothers carried books from the scriptorium, fetched water from the well, or made their way to the chapel when the bell called. But at night, the corridors became something entirely different. After Compline, when the final prayers of the day were finished, the monastery sank into darkness. The corridors then became narrow rivers of shadow, stretching endlessly, with only the occasional glimmer of moonlight slipping through a narrow window. Walking them in darkness was a test of the senses, as the echo of footsteps seemed amplified, and the silence grew so deep it bordered on sound itself. One strange practice in some monasteries was the use of corridor watch. A monk would be assigned to walk the halls at night, ensuring order, checking that no lamps had been left burning, and that the silence was preserved. Imagine being that monk, walking alone, hour after hour, through shadowed stone, listening for nothing more than the breathing of your brothers through the thin walls of their cells. Some described it as peaceful, others, more privately, admitted it was unnerving, as though the night whispered in ways daylight did not. The silence of the corridor was not only external but internal. In walking them, a monk was expected to keep his thoughts pure, free of distraction. Yet the strangeness of human nature is that silence often invites the opposite. When denied conversation, the mind creates its own dialogues. When forbidden to laugh or speak, it whispers inwardly. Many monks confessed that in the stillness of the corridor they found themselves remembering voices from their past, the rotism, laughter of family, the sound of a market, the cries of children they would never see again. In this way, the silence of the monastery's hallways became both a sanctuary and a torment, a place where memory itself grew louder. The design of the cloister, that square of open space surrounded by covered walkways, connected many of these corridors. The cloister was the beating heart of the monastery, yet even there silence held sway. A monk walking along its covered edge might feel the sunlight and hear the faint rustle of leaves in the courtyard, but he would still remain bound by silence. This peculiar mixture, open air and silence, movement and stillness, was unique to the monastic life. In a sense, the cloister and its corridors became a map of the inner life. Enclosed, orderly, quiet, yet threaded with paths that circled endlessly, always returning to the same center. What is perhaps most curious is how these corridors, these seemingly ordinary stone passages, shaped the very perception of time. To walk the same path every day, at the same hours, with the same silence, was to dissolve the distinction between one day and the next. The corridor became timeless, or perhaps outside of time altogether. Its stones did not change, its silence did not break. A monk could walk as he had the day before, and as he would the day after, until the pattern of his steps merged with the rhythm of the monastery itself. For us, variety keeps time moving. For them, repetition erased it. Some records suggest that monks occasionally experienced what we might call auditory illusions in these long passages. They heard footsteps where none followed, or whispers where none spoke. The rational explanation is simple: stone carries sound strangely, and draughts play tricks on the ears. But for the monk, immersed in prayer and solitude, such moments could feel like encounters with something otherworldly. Was it an angel passing unseen? Was it a test, a reminder of the unseen world? Or was it simply the mind, pressed too long by silence, inventing companions for itself? The rule forbade speculation, but the experiences lingered nonetheless, a private strangeness in an otherwise rigid life. To survive in the monastery, one had to learn to walk those corridors without seeking escape. The silence was not meant to be broken, but absorbed, like a tide that carried the mind into deeper waters. For the modern imagination, raised in noise and motion, this silence would be unbearable, even suffocating. But for the medieval monk, it became the very fabric of his existence. Each step in the corridor was a reminder that he was not his own, but belonged to the order, to the rhythm, to the silence itself. And so the long corridor of silence was not just stone and shadow. It was a teacher, a mirror, and sometimes a strange companion. It whispered lessons in discipline and humility, but also in the unsettling vastness of stillness. To walk it was to learn not only about the monastery, but about the unquiet nature of one's own mind. For though the stones were silent, the thoughts they provoked were not. When the monastery finally sank into the stillness of night, it was as though the world itself withdrew. The bells, which had punctuated every hour of the day, grew silent. The corridors, once filled with the soft shuffle of sandals, stood empty. The cloister lay in shadow, its open square bathed only in the faintest wash of moonlight, if the sky was clear. Nightfall in the monastery was not like nightfall in a village, where homes glowed with hearth fires, where laughter and talk carried faintly across the dark. Here, there was no murmur of voices, no flicker of candles from windows. The darkness was complete, and in its depth, it was strangely absolute. A monk's day did not end with the coming of night. Prayer had already fractured his sleep into uneasy segments, and so even at midnight he might be called to rise for the office of matins. To sleep, then, was never to sink fully into rest. It was to lie down in a cell where the cold pressed close, where the straw beneath him shifted uneasily, where the air was heavy with silence, and into that silence poured the vastness of night. Unlike the hours of daylight, when the rhythm of bells and labour guided every action, night gave no such structure. It was a time when the mind, released from duty, often wandered in ways it should not. The darkness of the monastery was more than the absence of light. It was tangible, almost thick, as though the stone walls themselves absorbed and multiplied it. Lamps were not left burning after compline. To do so was wasteful, and more than that, it was a breach of the rule. So when a monk returned to his cell after the final prayers of the day, he stepped into darkness that was nearly unbroken. The tiny window might admit a thread of moonlight, but more often it showed only the blankness of night sky. For most, the experience was one of confinement. The room itself seemed smaller, the air closer, the silence louder. And yet, there was a strangeness here as well. Many monks wrote of how the night seemed to dissolve the boundaries of their cell. In the stillness, with no sound to anchor them, they felt as though the stone walls melted away, leaving them suspended in a darkness without end. The effect was not always peaceful. Some described visions, strange shapes that hovered at the edges of perception, figures that seemed to appear and vanish as quickly as they came. The line between dream and waking blurred easily when sleep was broken repeatedly, when hunger and cold dulled the body, and when silence filled every gap left behind. There were the practical fears of night as well. Monasteries, though walled and fortified, were not immune to danger. Bandits sometimes raided, wolves prowled beyond the fields, storms battered the roofs. In the dark, the imagination gave these threats new shape. A creak of timber might sound like a bride-bine footstep. The wind through the cloister arches might resemble a whisper. It is not difficult to imagine a monk lying awake, heart slow but heavy, listening to sounds that had no explanation, and wondering if they came from outside or from within his own restless mind. Perhaps the most peculiar element of monastic night was the midnight rising. At the call of the bell, monks would leave their cells and gather in the church for matins. Picture them walking in silence, their sandals scuffing against stone, their cowls drawn low, each carrying the weight of sleep still heavy upon his body. They moved through corridors lit only by the dimmest lamps, or sometimes only by the pale gleam of moonlight through high windows. The air was cold, and the silence deeper than at any other hour. To pray in such a moment was to stand at a threshold between waking and sleeping, between night and day, between the seen and the unseen. Inside the church, the darkness was not banished, only softened. A few candles flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. The chant rose slowly, voices low, not strong but steady, weaving through the stillness. It was said that these prayers were the most important, for they pierced the deepest part of the night. Yet they also carried a kind of strangeness, a half-dreaming quality, as though the monks themselves were not entirely awake. Some would drift into moments of slumber even while standing, their bodies swaying gently with the rhythm of the chant. Others found themselves wandering in thought, not with the bright clarity of day but with the hazy unreliability of dreams. After the prayers, they returned again to their cells, to rest for a short while before the bell called once more. This rhythm, sleep, prayer, sleep, fractured the night into segments, denying the deep rest the body craved. The effect was cumulative. Over weeks and months, the monks lived in a state of half-wakefulness, where the boundaries of reality grew thin. It is little wonder, then, that many described strange dreams, visions, and whispers. Night was not only a time of rest, it was also a time of testing. For the modern imagination, night is softened by the presence of artificial light. Even in the quietest towns, lamps glow, windows shine, screens flicker. But in the medieval monastery, night retained its full force. It was a world without light, without distraction, without the comfort of a candle burning against the dark. In this way, monks experienced night more purely than we can today. Its depth, its silence, its unsettling power. It shaped their thoughts, their prayers, even their fears. There is something both peaceful and unsettling in imagining such a life. To surrender each night to darkness so complete, to rise at midnight for prayer, to return again to a bed of straw and a cell of stone. It is a rhythm that strips life to its barest elements. Body, breath, silence, shadow. And yet, within that bareness, strange things emerged. Visions, dreams, whispers, shadows that seemed to move, voices that seemed to call. Night was not an absent. It was its own presence, heavy, watchful, unyielding. To live within that presence was to live with a constant reminder. The world is larger than what the eyes can see, and the darkness holds mysteries that even prayer cannot fully explain. For the medieval monk, this was both a comfort and a trial. To us, it might be unbearable. The weight of time in a monastery was unlike the passing of days elsewhere. Outside the walls, seasons might be marked by harvests, by markets, by festivals, or by the endless chatter of villages. But here, within stone corridors and cloister walks, time took on a slower, heavier quality. It was measured not in events, but in repetition. The bell rang, the prayers were said, the meals were taken, the work was done, the rhythm repeated itself, day after day, year after year, until the seasons blurred into one another. What seemed to change was not the day, but the man who lived within it. For a monk, time was not meant to rush forward. It was not meant to bring novelty, excitement, or discovery. It was meant to settle like dust in a still room, layering upon itself until even the smallest moment carried weight. To sit in silence for an hour was not the passing of 60 minutes, but the deepening of stillness. To work in the fields from dawn until dusk was not only to complete a task, but to immerse the body in a rhythm older than memory. In this way, time in the monastery was not something to escape. It was something to inhabit fully, and yet, for all its steadiness, time was also a burden. Imagine waking each morning knowing exactly what the day will bring. There is comfort in such certainty, but there is also a quiet heaviness. For some, the predictability of the hours felt like a stone pressing down. A man might know that for the next 40 years, perhaps longer, he will rise to the same bells. walk the same corridors, recite the same prayers, eat the same meals. The weight of such knowledge is difficult to carry without bending beneath it. In the cloister walks, where the monks paced slowly, often in meditation, the passing of time was inscribed even in the stone. Steps wore grooves into the flagstones, shallow dips where countless feet had moved in quiet procession. To look down upon such marks was to see the accumulation of years, not in stories or memories, but in the erosion of stone itself. The walls, too, bore the weight of centuries, scratches from torches, soot from candles, faint carvings left behind by hands now long gone. Every mark spoke of the countless hours already lived, already past, already folded into the great silence of the place. For the monk himself, time was not simply endured, it was meant to be transformed into devotion. Each hour was consecrated, set aside, dedicated to prayer or labour. In theory, there was no wasted time, for even the smallest task, sweeping a floor, mending a robe, copying a page, was performed in the presence of eternity. Yet the mind, as fragile as it is, often strayed. There were moments when the hours stretched too long, when the silence pressed too heavily, when the sameness of the day seemed unbearable. It is in such moments that time became most burdensome. Some monks recorded the sensation of days bleeding into one another, so that it was difficult to tell one from the next. The memory of a particular meal, a particular prayer, or a particular task would dissolve into the countless others like it. In this way, time in the monastery sometimes ceased to feel linear. It became circular, repeating endlessly, to rise, to pray, to labour, to eat, to sleep, to rise again. It was not a journey forward, but a continual return. For some, this was a form of peace. For others, it was a subtle trial. The seasons provided the only visible markers of change. The biting cold of winter crept into the stone walls, settling in the marrow of bones. Spring brought damp air, the smell of earth after rain, the sound of birds at the edges of the fields. Summer filled the hours with labour beneath the sun, sweat dripping beneath the heavy wool of robes. Autumn offered the quiet of harvest, the fields stripped bare, the trees fading into silence. Yet even these cycles repeated, returning each year with familiar predictability. The monks lived not in pursuit of the new, but in patient acceptance of the return. And still, the human mind is drawn to reckon with time in ways it cannot escape. Birthdays, though unmarked, still passed. The body aged, joints stiffened, eyes dimmed. The younger novices became old men, and in time, they too would be buried in the earth beyond the cloister wall, their graves marked only by simple stones. To live in a monastery was to live with constant awareness of mortality, not in fear, but in a quiet, steady recognition that each day, no matter how similar to the last, moved one step closer to the end. This awareness gave weight to even the simplest acts. To turn a page in a manuscript, to light a candle, to bow in prayer, all were infused with the knowledge that time itself was slipping, and that each motion was both fleeting and eternal. There was no rush, no need to hurry, for the hours belonged not to the monk but to the rhythm of the rule. Yet within that surrender was the quiet truth. Time was always moving, even when it felt still. There is something haunting in imagining such a life. To wake in the same stone room each day, to hear the same bells, to walk the same worn paths, to measure one's existence not by change, but by endurance. For the monk, this was the path to devotion. For us, it is a glimpse into a way of living almost beyond comprehension. We live in a world of constant novelty, endless change, and restless movement. To imagine days that stretch out in sameness, year after year, is both unsettling and strangely calming. Perhaps the most profound weight of time in the monastery was not its sameness, but its depth. To sit in silence for an hour, with nothing but the sound of one's own breath, is to feel time differently. It does not pass lightly, as it does when filled with distraction. It settles, it thickens, it becomes almost physical. The monks lived within this thickness, day after day, until the hours themselves seemed to expand. What to us might feel like a single long moment became to them a lifetime of stillness. And so, when the final bell tolled for a monk's life, it was not only the end of years, it was the completion of a rhythm, the closing of a circle that had turned countless times before. His life was not marked by great events or dramatic moments, but by the patient accumulation of days, each layered quietly upon the next. Time, in the end, was both the burden he carried and the devotion he offered. As we step back from this quiet world, it is worth pausing to feel its weight ourselves. The stillness of hours, the repetition of the days, the depth of silence, the slow turning of seasons. In the lives of monks, we find a mirror of time itself, steady, unrelenting, yet filled with a subtle beauty. And now, as our story reaches its close, let us leave the monastery walls behind, carrying with us the calm rhythm of their days. May the weight of time, so heavy in those stone corridors, rest lightly upon you as you drift into sleep. May the silence of their nights become the silence of your own. Good night.